It was pointed out to me that there were a couple of wRAP quiz questions from Module 1 that I didn't explain, even though there was some struggle with them. And if I'm going to answer a couple of the questions, and if I miss any, just shoot me another email. All right, so this is our first screencast of the semester, and I took a selfie for you, just because I knew how much you'd like it. Here we go. All right, the first question that that some teams missed, that I missed, the fact that some teams missed, was this one, which is an example of a negative feedback loop. So feedback loops can be positive or negative, and it's positive and negative are perhaps somewhat misleading terms. Positive usually means good, and negative means bad. But when we talk about feedback loops, what we mean is something is happening, and as a result, something else happened. That's the feedback. And if it's positive, whatever is happening is amplified by the feedback. So if it's a good thing happening, a positive feedback loop will make it better. But if it's a bad thing happening, the feedback loop is going to amplify that. So even though it's a positive feedback loop, if it's a bad thing to begin with, it's going to be worse. So likewise, a negative feedback loop is feedback that causes the initial event or the effects of the initial event to become smaller. The feedback event runs in the opposite direction. And so that's a negative feedback loop. And if it's a good thing, a negative feedback loop will actually reduce the benefits of the good thing. And if it's a bad thing, a negative feedback loop is going to mean that the harm of the bad thing is going to be smaller. So that's what we mean. Get your mind around that vocabulary, and then I don't think it's too bad. So let's just examine these things. Organic certification improved coffee growers' environmental performance. And that I guess we could say that I don't know, the organic certification is supposed to, you get it organically certified because your environmental practices become better. So there's no feedback there, I would argue on that A, so I'm going to eliminate A. B, as oil becomes more scarce, higher prices lead to the switch to renewable energy. And so let's think about that. Oil is becoming scarce. We know from our economic models that if supply of a already scarce commodity becomes smaller, then we know the price is going to go up. But what happens when the price goes up? Well, people want to use less of the thing, oil in this case, whose price has gotten higher. And what's more, the incentive to develop alternative energy becomes greater when the price of the oil goes up. So here, because when the oil becomes scarce, the price of oil goes up, and then people don't want to use so much oil anymore. That's a negative feedback loop. The scarcity of oil is triggering events in the economy that reduce the magnitude of the problem. This was really a relevant phenomenon back when peak oil, everybody was talking about peak oil, and I was teaching this class, environmental economics, and I was telling my class that the problem is not peak oil, the problem is we've got way too much oil. We had at that time 50 years of proven reserves. I think we still have about 50 years of proven reserves because they've discovered more. Anyway, when we do hit the point where oil truly does become scarce, that's when we're going to see the price of oil skyrocket, not in the fluctuations we observe these days. One year they're up, the next year they're down, but in a very long run sense. And then investing in wind, investing in solar, investing in alternative energy is going to be a great investment because you're not going to run the risk that oil prices are going to drop and run you out of the business, somewhat like is happening now. Anyway, so B is the right answer. Let me just emphasize that, and just to consider C and D. A warming planet causes Arctic permafrost to melt, releasing methane, a greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere. Well, that methane that's released is making the global warming, the climate change problem worse. So that's very much a positive feedback loop. It's a terrible event, but because the feedback makes the terrible event worse, it's a positive feedback loop. And that's, you got to get your mind around the different sense of that positive word there. Finally, oil industry lobbyists secure tax breaks for investors in oil exploration projects. That's not a, well, let's think about it. The oil industry generates profits, and those profits give them more resources to hire oil industry lobbyists, and they secure tax breaks for investors in oil, and then oil becomes, they explore more. I guess there we're going to rule that out because the initial event isn't the oil scarcity. If it had been, actually, that would have been another negative, in the sense that if oil scarcity is the issue, not the environmental harm of the oil scarcity generates high prices, generate high profits, generate the high oil prices. If we, again, I'm expanding the Part D into what it's not, but if it were, oil becomes more scarce. One of the negative feedback of oil becoming more scarce is not just the incentive to look for alternative energy sources, but it's also to look for more oil. And damn it, they keep finding it, which is why our proven reserves keep staying so large, and the harm from fossil fuels seems so difficult to stop committing. It's not just fixing the harm out there; it's hard to stop causing additional harm. All right, moving on. Hopefully that cleared up some of the positive, negative terminology confusion. And I grant you, it is confusing. Here we go. One more. Sorry, I took just a scan with my iPad. The perspective on this one changed a little bit. Which of the following external diseconomies does not result in an economic inefficiency? And the external diseconomies that result in economic inefficiency are the ones that are not priced. So a pecuniary externality is the name of the one that is an externality, but it is priced, and thus doesn't, the market system, the market agents react to that. It's when the problem is, or when the external effect is not priced, is when we have a problem. Anyway, certainly sulfur dioxide is an unpriced resource that corrupts the clean air, causes all sorts of respiratory problems, acid rain, etc. This is the external diseconomy that causes environmental, economic inefficiency. So A isn't it. C, rowdy teenagers party on the beach, play loud music that disturbs others, also not priced. Also, when those rowdy teenagers don't consider the harm to others when they decide what music to play. Excuse me. That's our classic external diseconomy that does result in economic inefficiency. Unregulated ocean-going commercial fishing boat catches salmon, and catching that salmon, the fishery is depleted. Other people can't catch that salmon. Indeed, the salmon population could become unviable, or certainly smaller than the optimal size from the point of view of harvest or environmental sustainability, species viability. That's a classic external diseconomy that does result in economic inefficiency. So which one doesn't? It turns out B doesn't, and this is simply because when a new farmer buys land to farm tomatoes, that new demand, that new activity will drive up the price of farmland. For people that don't own farmland, that's a negative externality, but that the reason why we call it, we don't call it we call it a pecuniary externality, if you remember that from your reading. The effect was the scarcity of land was reflected in the rise in price of land, particularly land that's good for growing tomatoes, presumably. Anyway, So that's a pecuniary externality. That's just vocabulary from the reading. Hopefully you had that in your notes. It's a pretty fine distinction. I'm not going to emphasize it too greatly because usually we're in this course we're almost exclusively, well, pretty close to exclusively dealing with classic external diseconomies that don't get that cause scarcity rents that don't get reflected in the market prices of the goods, the associated goods.